The sound of the desert is never truly a silence. It is a low, rhythmic hum, the friction of a billion grains of sand dancing against the base of towering sandstone cliffs. If you were to stand at the mouth of the narrow gorge known as the Seek, you would feel a sudden sharp drop in temperature as the heat of the Jordanian sun is swallowed by the shadows of the stone. Here, the air carries the faint, ghostly scent of crushed juniper and ancient dust, a reminder that time is not a line, but a layer of sediment, waiting to be brushed away. For centuries, this path was a secret, whispered only by the winds and the nomadic tribes who guarded its entrance, a winding, subterranean artery that leads into the heart of a mountain range carved into a city of rose and ochre. We often imagine the past as a series of well-documented events, yet when we look at the jagged peaks of the Shara Mountains, we are reminded of the profound limits of our own understanding. The deeper one ventures into this labyrinth of stone, the more the modern world begins to dissolve, replaced by the weight of deep time, a span of ages so vast that our own lives feel like the briefest flicker of a candle in a cavern. The cliffs here do not merely stand, they lean inward, their surfaces marbled with veins of purple, blue, and deep crimson, as if the earth itself were blushing at the secrets it holds. As the wind whistles through the narrow gaps, one can almost hear the echoes of camel caravans from 2,000 years ago, the soft thud of hooves on sand, the clinking of silver coins, and the heavy, sweet aroma of frankincense and myrrh. This was the Red City, a trade hub that should not have existed in such a desolate, waterless expanse, and yet it thrived, hidden away from the prying eyes of empires. The Nabataeans, the architects of this impossible place, remain one of history's most enduring enigmas, emerging from the haze of the desert as master engineers before vanishing back into the sands, leaving behind only their silent stone monuments. As you settle into your blankets and let the weight of the day drift away, you might find yourself wondering how many other stories lie buried beneath the earth, waiting for a quiet moment to be told. If you are joining us tonight to find a peaceful end to your day, I am glad you are here. At the Slumber Archives, we gather these fragments of the past and weave them into new narrations every single day, creating a space where history and rest can meet. If you find comfort in these journeys through time, perhaps you might consider subscribing so that we can meet here again tomorrow night. A simple like also helps our community grow, allowing others to find their way to these quiet archives. But for now, let the world outside fade into the distance as we return to the shadows of the Seek. The Nabataeans did not leave behind volumes of poetry or detailed chronicles of their kings. Instead, they spoke through the medium of the mountain itself. To understand them, archaeologists must rely on the slow, meticulous work of stratigraphy, the study of rock layers that tells a story of occupation, abandonment, and the slow reclamation of nature. They use radiocarbon dating, a process that measures the decay of carbon atoms to pin a moment in time, to try and catch a glimpse of when the first chisel struck the rose-red stone. Yet even with our modern tools, the origins of Petra remain shrouded. Some suggest the site was sacred long before the first tomb was carved, perhaps dating back to the end of the Younger Dryas, a period of abrupt cooling and climate upheaval nearly 12,000 years ago that forced humanity to adapt or perish. Imagine the patience required to transform a vertical cliff face into a palace. It is a process that defies the hurried pace of our modern lives. The Nabataeans began at the very top, carving a ledge into the rock and working their way downward, using the mountain as their own scaffolding. As they descended, they revealed the vibrant, swirling patterns of the sandstone, colors that have been trapped in total darkness for millions of years before being brought into the light. This was not merely construction. It was a conversation with the geology of the earth. They understood the way water moved through the parched landscape, honeycombing the cliffs with hidden channels and cisterns that allowed a city of 30,000 people to flourish in a land that receives less than 4 inches of rain a year. As we walk deeper into the Sikh, the walls rise higher, sometimes reaching over 200 feet toward a narrow ribbon of sky. The light here is filtered and soft, casting a dreamlike glow on the stone. There is a strange, heavy stillness in this corridor, a sense that the rock is listening. We are walking through a geological rift, a tear in the crust of the world that the Nabataeans turned into a grand ceremonial entrance. Every step takes us further from the known and closer to the heart of the mystery. Who were these people who could turn a desert into a garden? How did they manage to control the trade of the ancient world from a fortress of stone? And why, after centuries of prosperity, did they simply fade away? The mystery of Petra is not just in its beauty, but in its silence. It is a city of the dead that feels vibrantly alive, a place where the barrier between the past and the present feels remarkably thin. The more we learn about the Nabataeans, the more we realize how much we have forgotten. They were a people who lived in harmony with the most brutal elements of nature, finding abundance where others saw only emptiness. As the years passed and the trade routes shifted, the Red City was eventually reclaimed by the sand and the silence, becoming a legend, a ghost story told by the Bedouin to explorers who refused to believe such a place could exist. And so, we continue our descent into the shadows, moving slowly through the winding path of the Sikh. The air is cool, the ground is soft beneath our feet, and the stone walls seem to pulse with a low, ancient energy. We are searching for the moment when the narrow gorge finally opens, revealing the sight that has left travelers breathless for 2 millennia. The first glimpse of the Treasury glowing like a vision in the darkness. But for now, we remain in the passage, suspended in the quiet, in the half-light of history, where the secrets of the Red City are still held fast by the desert wind. Long before the first chisel struck the rose-coloured cliffs, there was only the sound of the wind moving through the dry scrub and the rhythmic crunch of gravel beneath the hooves of camels. To understand the city, we must first understand the silence that preceded it. A time when the people who would become the Nabataeans were little more than ghosts in the landscape, moving with the seasons and the stars. They were pastoralists, nomads of the deep desert, who left no permanent footprint, no foundations of stone, and no written records of their early migrations. In the eyes of the settled world, the great empires of the Greeks and the Persians, they were a shadow people, appearing and disappearing into the haze of the Arabian interior like a mirage. The earliest accounts we possess describe them as a people who took a solemn vow never to build houses, never to plant trees, and never to drink wine. This was not merely a cultural quirk, but a survival strategy honed over centuries of living in a land that offers nothing to those who do not know its secrets. By remaining mobile, they remained free. By refusing to till the earth, they ensured that no conqueror could ever hold them hostage by threatening their crops. They were masters of the high desert, a region so desolate that it served as a natural fortress, protecting them from the ambitions of kings who looked upon the sands and saw only a wasteland. But beneath the surface of this nomadic simplicity lay a sophisticated understanding of the environment that borders on the miraculous. In a world where water is more precious than gold, the Nabataeans learned to find it where others saw only parched earth. They became experts in hydraulic engineering, though their early works were hidden from view. They carved deep cisterns into the limestone, lining them with a specialized waterproof plaster that kept the precious liquid cool and clean for months or even years. They camouflaged the openings of these pits so perfectly that an invading army could march right over 1,000,000 gallons of water and die of thirst, never knowing that life was vibrating just a few feet beneath their sandals. This mastery of the hidden resource gave them an invisible empire, a network of secret waypoints that allowed them to traverse the most lethal stretches of the desert with ease. As the centuries drifted by, these wanderers began to notice a shift in the world around them. The great civilizations of the Mediterranean and the East were developing an insatiable hunger for the luxuries of the South, specifically the aromatic resins of frankincense and myrrh. These substances, harvested from the gnarled trees of the Dhofar region and the Horn of Africa, were the lifeblood of the ancient world's spiritual and social rituals. They were burned in the temples of Egypt, used in the funeral pyres of Roman emperors, and ground into the perfumes of the wealthy. But to get these treasures from the southern coast of the Arabian Peninsula to the markets of Gaza and Damascus, one had to cross the vast, burning heart of the desert. It was here, in the quiet spaces between the dunes, that the Nabataeans saw their opportunity. They transitioned from simple herders and occasional raiders into the most essential middlemen of the ancient world. They did not just know the routes, they owned them. They knew where the sand was firm enough for a laden camel to walk without sinking. They knew which mountain passes were sheltered from the blistering midday sun, and they knew exactly how many days of travel lay between one hidden well and the next. Slowly, the raiding parties that had once harassed the edges of the settled world transformed into organized caravans, and the fierce independence of the nomad was channeled into the calculated precision of the merchant. There is a profound mystery in this transition, a period of deep time where the archaeological record is thin and the stories are few. We call this the process of sedentarization, but that word feels too clinical for the transformation of a soul. How does a person who has lived under the open sky for 1,000 generations decide to stop? What is the catalyst that turns a tent dweller into a stonecutter? Perhaps it was the sheer wealth that began to flow into their hands, a river of silver and gold that demanded a place of safekeeping. Or perhaps it was something more spiritual, a realization that this specific canyon, with its towering walls and hidden springs, was a place where the divine met the earth. As they grew rich from the incense trade, the Nabataeans began to settle in the area we now know as Petra, though they likely called it Rakmu. At first, they may have continued to live in tents, even as they began to carve the first rudimentary chambers into the rock. It is a strange image to contemplate. A city of silk and goat hair shelters nestled at the foot of massive, unfinished monuments. They were a bridge between two worlds, carrying the rugged endurance of the desert in their hearts, while their hands began to learn the delicate arts of the Hellenistic world. They were watching, learning, and absorbing the techniques of the civilizations they traded with, waiting for the moment to reveal their own architectural vision to the world. The strategic brilliance of their location cannot be overstated. Petra sits at a crossroads where the north-south trade routes intersected with the east-west paths leading toward the Persian Gulf. By controlling this bottleneck, the Nabataeans effectively held the keys to the global economy of their time. They were the gatekeepers of the desert. If a merchant wanted his goods to reach the sea, he had to pay the Nabataean toll. In exchange, he received protection, water, and the expertise of the desert's finest navigators. It was a partnership born of necessity, but it elevated a tribe of nomads to the status of a world power, a kingdom of the sands that would eventually rival the majesty of Rome itself. And so, the stage was set. The wealth was accumulating, the water was flowing through hidden pipes, and the nomadic spirit was beginning to crystallize into something permanent. The people who had once vowed never to build were now standing before the great red cliffs, seeing not just stone, but a canvas. They were preparing to write their history in the mountain itself, creating a city that was meant to be invisible from the outside, a secret sanctuary where the desert's riches could be gathered and guarded. As we move deeper into the canyon, we are following the same path those early merchants took, moving from the wild, open freedom of the dunes into the structured, shadowed elegance of a civilization that was just beginning to find its voice in the silence of the stone. The air here is cooler now, the temperature dropping as the walls of the sick rise higher and higher above us. You can almost hear the echoes of the camel trains, the clatter of wooden crates filled with spices, the low murmur of men speaking in a language that has since faded from the earth, and the rhythmic thud of the lead scout's staff. They were a people of the threshold, living in the space between the known and the unknown, and as we continue our journey, we begin to see the first signs of their handiwork. Small niches carved into the rock to hold the idols of their gods, and the faint traces of the water channels that once hummed with the sound of life-giving streams. The desert was no longer an enemy to be survived. It had become a kingdom to be ruled. We are walking through the heart of a metamorphosis. The transition from nomad to king, from raider to merchant, is etched into every layer of the sandstone. It is a reminder that nothing is static, that even the most ancient traditions can shift when the world demands it. But even as they built their temples and their theatres, the Nabataeans never truly lost their connection to the vastness of the sands. They remained a people of the horizon, always looking outward, always aware that the desert that gave them their power could just as easily take it back. For now, however, the city is rising, a dream of stone and water, waiting to be revealed in the soft, flickering light of the torches. Imagine the sound of a single drop of water falling against the floor of a dry stone basin, a sharp, clear note that echoes through the silence of a canyon. In the high desert of southern Jordan, where the sun bleaches the earth into shades of bone and ochre, such a sound is more than a mere occurrence. It is a miracle. To the traveller of 2,000 years ago, arriving at the gates of the Red City after weeks of parched travel, the presence of water was not just a luxury, but a profound statement of power. It was the ultimate secret of the Nabataeans, a hidden mastery over the most precious element in the world, tucked away behind the towering walls of the sick. While other desert cultures followed the seasonal rains like shadows, the people of this city learned to catch the rain and hold it captive, turning a barren wilderness into a lush, permanent oasis that defied the very laws of the landscape. The challenge they faced was one of extremes. For most of the year, the Wadi Musa, the Valley of Moses, is a place of shimmering heat and dry riverbeds. But when the winter storms break over the surrounding mountains, the water does not merely fall, it descends in violent, unpredictable torrents. These flash floods are capable of carving through solid rock, carrying boulders and debris with enough force to sweep away anything in their path. To build a city here was to invite destruction, unless one could find a way to tame the fury of the mountain runoff. And so, the Nabataeans became the greatest hydraulic engineers of the ancient world, developing a system of water management so sophisticated that its remnants still leave modern researchers in a state of quiet awe. They began by looking upward, tracing the natural contours of the sandstone cliffs. They realized that every crevice, every slope, and every flat plateau was a potential catchment area. With patient precision, they carved long, narrow channels directly into the face of the rock. Tiny stone gutters that wound around the mountainsides for miles. These channels were designed with a very specific, gentle gradient, ensuring that the water would flow at a steady, controlled pace rather than rushing downward with erosive force. As you walk through the city today, you can still see these grooves, worn smooth by centuries of use, following the curves of the canyon walls like the veins of the earth itself. But collecting the water was only the first step. The true genius lay in how they stored it. Beneath the paved streets, under the floors of private villas, and deep within the shadows of the great temple, the Nabataeans carved hundreds of massive cisterns. These were not simple holes in the ground, but expertly engineered subterranean chambers, often lined with a specialized hydraulic lime plaster that was waterproof and incredibly durable. Some of these cisterns were large enough to hold millions of gallons of water, kept cool and dark beneath the stone, protected from the relentless evaporation of the desert sun. It is estimated that at the height of the city's power, these reservoirs could sustain a population of 30,000 people, along with their livestock and the thousands of camels that passed through on the trade routes, even during years of extreme drought. As the years passed and the city grew, the Nabataeans moved beyond simple stone channels. They began to manufacture terracotta pipes, thousands of them, fired in local kilns and fitted together with airtight precision. These pipes allowed them to create pressurized water systems, bringing fresh spring water from miles away directly into the heart of the city. They understood the principles of gravity and fluid dynamics long before these concepts were codified in textbooks. In the center of the city, they constructed a massive garden pool complex, a sprawling artificial lake surrounded by palm trees and exotic plants, where the sound of splashing fountains provided a constant, cooling backdrop to the heat of the day. To a weary merchant arriving from the burning sands of the Hijaz, the sight of a swimming pool in the middle of a desert canyon must have seemed like a hallucination, a display of wealth and technical brilliance that signaled the Nabataeans were no longer mere nomads, but masters of the impossible. There is a certain poetry in the way they managed the Wadi Musa itself. To prevent the city from being washed away during the rainy season, they constructed a massive dam at the entrance to the Sikh, diverting the floodwaters through a specially carved tunnel in the mountain. This kept the main entrance to the city dry and safe, while simultaneously channeling the excess water into their storage systems. It was a philosophy of harmony rather than resistance. They did not try to stop the water, but rather invited it in, guiding its path with a gentle hand. This infrastructure allowed for a level of permanent settlement that should have been impossible in such a landscape. It allowed for the planting of vineyards, the cultivation of olive groves, and the creation of lush gardens that bloomed in the shadows of the red cliffs. When we look at these systems through the lens of modern archaeology, using techniques like stratigraphy, the study of rock and soil layers to determine the chronological sequence of events, we see a civilization that was constantly refining its methods. They were observers of the long cycle, aware of the deep time that governed the desert. They knew that the rains might fail for a decade, or that a single night could bring a century's worth of water. Their engineering was a form of insurance against the whims of the gods, a way to anchor their dream of stone in a world of shifting sands. And yet, there is a lingering mystery in the silence of these empty pipes and dry basins. How did a people who had spent centuries moving with the seasons suddenly acquire such specialized knowledge? Some suggest it was a gradual process of trial and error, a slow accumulation of wisdom passed down through generations of desert dwellers. Others wonder if they traded for this knowledge, absorbing the secrets of distant lands along with the frankincense and myrrh that filled their storehouses. Regardless of its origin, the result was a city that functioned like a living organism, its lifeblood flowing through hidden veins of clay and stone. As you sit in the stillness of the canyon today, it is easy to imagine the city at night, when the heat of the day has finally broken. The air would have been filled with the soft, rhythmic sound of water trickling through the stone channels, a constant reminder of the security the Nabataeans had built for themselves. The scent of damp earth and blooming jasmine would have drifted through the streets, mingling with the smell of wood smoke and roasting meat. This was the true power of the Red City, not its gold, nor its armies, but its ability to turn a wasteland into a sanctuary. But water is a fickle master. It requires constant maintenance, the clearing of silt, the patching of cracks, and the steady hand of a centralized authority to ensure its fair distribution. As long as the city remained strong and its people remained vigilant, the water flowed. But the desert is patient, It waits for the moment when the channels are neglected, when the plaster begins to crumble, and when the memory of how to manage the floods begins to fade. The very engineering that allowed the city to flourish also made it vulnerable, for without the water, the stone is just stone, and the dream of the desert hub is nothing more than a ghost in the sand. The mystery of the water is perhaps the most human chapter of this story. It speaks to the universal desire to find a place of belonging, to build something lasting in a world that is always changing. The Nabataeans looked at the dry, sun-scorched earth and saw not a void, but a canvas. They listened to the silence of the canyon and heard the potential for music, and for a few glorious centuries they succeeded in making the desert bloom, leaving behind a legacy of terracotta and stone that still whispers to us across the vastness of time. A reminder that even in the harshest of environments, the spirit of innovation can find a way to thrive, provided it knows how to listen to the rhythm of the rain. Imagine, if you will, the sound of a single iron chisel striking the face of a rose-colored cliff, a rhythmic, metallic ring that echoes through the narrow gorge, carried on a breeze that smells of dry dust and ancient cedar. This sound was the heartbeat of the city for generations, the steady pulse of a people who did not merely inhabit the landscape, but who reached into the very bones of the earth to pull forth their homes and their temples. The Nabataeans possessed a vision that reversed the traditional logic of the builder. While the rest of the world looked to the ground to lay a foundation and reach toward the heavens, these desert architects began at the summit, working in intimate conversation with the heights of the sandstone massifs. The process of carving these monolithic facades was an act of profound faith and terrifying precision. A master mason would first ascend the rugged slopes, standing atop the high ridges where the eagles nested, looking down into the shadows of the canyon floor. There at the precipice they would begin. It is a technique known as rock-cut architecture, but to describe it so clinically fails to capture the sheer audacity of the feat. They carved from the top down, a method that allowed them to forgo the need for massive wooden scaffolding, a precious commodity in a land where trees were scarce, and every scrap of timber was needed for trade or fuel. By standing on a narrow ledge of their own making, the workers would chip away at the vertical face, descending floor by floor as the mountains slowly transformed into a monument. As the sun moves across the sky, the shadows on these facades shift and dance, revealing a strange and beautiful marriage of cultures that shouldn't, by the laws of geography, ever have met in the middle of a desert. The Nabataeans were the great chameleons of the ancient world, their eyes wide open to the aesthetics of every traveller who passed through their gates. In the intricate carvings of the Treasury and the Monastery, we see the ghost of Greece in the elegant Corinthian columns and the triangular pediments that seem to have been plucked from a temple in Athens. Yet, right beside these Hellenistic flourishes, one finds the heavy, symbolic weight of Egypt. The winged solar discs, the watchful figures of Isis, and the stepped battlements that look toward the Nile. It is a visual language of fusion, a testament to a civilization that saw no borders in art, only possibilities. We must wonder what it felt like to be the first sculptor to press a tool against a blank wall of stone, knowing that a single misplaced strike could ruin a masterpiece centuries in the making. There was no room for error, no way to replace a piece of stone once it had been hewn away. The stonemasons used tools that were simple yet effective. Heavy iron picks to remove the bulk of the rock, followed by finer chisels to smooth the surfaces and create the delicate fluting of the columns. If you were to run your hand along the inner walls of these chambers today, you might still feel the diagonal marks left by those ancient blades, a tactile signature of a craftsman who lived 2,000 years ago. They worked with the grain of the sandstone, understanding its soft, sedimentary layers, and the way the iron-rich minerals created swirls of ochre, violet and crimson within the rock itself. The mystery deepens when we consider the sheer scale of the labor. Thousands of tons of stone had to be removed, carried away in baskets to leave behind these hollowed-out cathedrals of silence. And yet, there is a lightness to the architecture, an elegance that defies the weight of the mountain. The Nabataeans understood the play of light. They angled their facades so that at certain hours of the day the sun would penetrate deep into the interior, illuminating the tombs with a golden glow that must have felt like a divine presence. It was a way of bringing the celestial down into the terrestrial, of anchoring the fleeting beauty of the sky into the eternal endurance of the stone. As the centuries have passed, the wind and the rare torrential rains have softened the edges of these carvings, blurring the lines between the work of man and the work of nature. Some of the figures have lost their faces to the erosion of time, becoming smooth, featureless guardians of the canyon. This slow decay only adds to the sense of patient mystery that permeates the site. We look at the unfinished tombs, where the carving stopped abruptly halfway down the cliff, and we are forced to confront the limits of our knowledge. Was it a sudden war that stayed the mason's hand? A plague? Or perhaps a shift in the trade routes that rendered the project obsolete? The stone remains silent, holding its secrets behind a veil of rose-colored dust. The tools themselves tell a story of technological continuity and sudden innovation. Archaeologists have found the remains of iron points and heavy hammers, but they also find evidence of sophisticated measuring systems. To maintain the perfect symmetry of a facade that is 40 meters high, while suspended on a narrow ledge, requires a mastery of geometry that rivals the builders of the pyramids. They used plumb lines and leveling devices, perhaps even reflecting mirrors to bounce light into the dark corners of their work. Every inch was calculated, every curve intentional, creating a city that felt less like it was built and more like it was exhaled by the earth itself. Meanwhile, the interiors of these structures offer a startling contrast to the ornate exteriors. Step inside one of the great halls, and you are met with a vast, echoing emptiness. Smooth walls and high ceilings that seem to amplify the sound of your own breathing. These were not merely places for the dead, though many served as family vaults. They were spaces for the living to gather, to feast in honor of their ancestors, and to conduct the business of a global empire. The coolness of the stone provides a natural sanctuary from the blistering heat outside, a thermal mass that keeps the air at a constant, gentle temperature. It is a reminder that the Nabataeans were masters of their environment, creating a comfortable urban existence in a place where most would struggle to survive a single day. As we contemplate the art of the rock-cut city, we are reminded of the vast stretches of deep time that separate us from its creators. 2 millennia is but a blink in the geological history of the sandstone, yet it is an eternity in the history of human endeavor. The Nabataeans were a bridge, a link between the ancient traditions of the East and the rising influence of the West, carving their identity into the very landscape so that it could never be truly erased. They knew that empires rise and fall, that water sources can vanish, and that kings are eventually forgotten. But the stone, if treated with enough reverence, will endure. And so, the city remains, a gallery of stone that stretches for miles through the winding crevices of the desert. Each facade is a page in a book we are still learning how to read, filled with symbols of protection, wealth, and spiritual longing. The Hellenistic pediments tell us of their worldly ambitions, while the simple, unadorned niches in the rock remind us of their nomadic roots, when a simple stone pillar was enough to represent the presence of a god. It is this tension between the grand and the humble, the foreign and the local, that gives the architecture its haunting power. The stonemasons are long gone, their names lost to the shifting sands, but their vision remains carved into the cliffs. A permanent record of a time when humanity looked at a mountain and saw not an obstacle, but a masterpiece waiting to be released. A single rhythmic sound echoes through the narrow corridor of the sick, the soft, muffled thud of footsteps on sand, a sound that has repeated for 2,000 years. As the towering walls of the canyon begin to pull apart, a sliver of light reveals something so precise, so impossibly elegant, that it feels less like a building and more like a vision. This is Al-Khazneh, the Treasury. It stands nearly 40 meters tall, carved directly into the iron-rich face of the mountain, with a level of detail that defies the primitive tools of the 1st century. While the rest of the city slowly reveals its utilitarian side, the Treasury remains an enigma of pure aesthetics, a monument that seems to have been breathed into the stone rather than hewn from it. For centuries, travelers and historians have debated the true nature of this structure. Its name, the Treasury, comes from a local Bedouin legend that a great Egyptian pharaoh once hid his riches within the stone urn at the very top of the facade. If you look closely at that urn today, you can see the scars of bullet holes, marks left by tribesmen who fired their rifles at the stone, hoping to shatter the vessel and trigger a rain of ancient gold. But the urn is solid sandstone. There was never any gold hidden in the heights. Instead, the true wealth of the Treasury is found in its purpose, which modern archaeology suggests was far more solemn than a bank or a storehouse. Based on the presence of burial chambers beneath the main floor and the intricate iconography of the facade, many scholars now believe this was a royal tomb, perhaps the final resting place of King Aretas IV, the most powerful of all the Nabataean monarchs. The carvings themselves tell a story of a culture that was deeply connected to the wider world, weaving together the myths of the Mediterranean with the mysteries of the East. On the lower level, standing guard over the entrance, are the weathered figures of Castor and Pollux, the Dioscuri. In Greek mythology, these twin brothers were the protectors of travelers, believed to escort the souls of the dead on their final journey. It is a poignant choice for a desert people who made their living by guiding caravans across the most treacherous landscapes on earth. To the Nabataeans, the transition from life to death was perhaps not so different from a long journey across the dunes, a passage that required a steady hand and the protection of the gods. As we look higher up the facade, the figures become more ethereal. There are dancing Amazons, swinging axes, and the central figure of a goddess who appears to be a fusion of Isis, the Egyptian mother, and Tyche, the Greek goddess of fortune. She holds a cornucopia, a symbol of abundance in a land where water was more precious than silver. These images remind us that Petra was a crossroads of the human spirit, a place where ideas flowed as freely as the incense and silk that passed through its gates. The stonemasons who worked here were not just labourers, they were philosophers of the rock, blending the traditions of distant empires to create something entirely unique to the desert. The precision of the work is particularly staggering when one considers the method of construction. Unlike the Greeks or Romans, who built from the ground up using scaffolding and pulleys, the Nabataeans began at the very top. They carved a ledge into the cliff face and worked their way down, using the mountain itself as their platform. This meant there was no room for error. A single misplaced stroke of the chisel on a Corinthian column or a decorative frieze could not be undone. The symmetry we see today is the result of a terrifyingly perfect foresight. They had to visualize the entire finished monument within the raw, unformed cliff before the first chip of stone ever fell to the ground. And yet, for all its outward beauty, the interior of the Treasury is surprisingly stark. Beyond the grand entrance lies a series of plain, dark chambers, stripped of any ornamentation. This contrast between the public spectacle of the facade and the private silence of the interior creates a lingering sense of mystery. Was it truly a tomb, or did these rooms once hold something even more sacred? Some suggest the Treasury was a temple dedicated to the deified kings, a place where the living could commune with the ancestors who had turned the desert into an empire. As the light changes throughout the day, The color of the treasury shifts from a pale, dusty rose to a deep, burning crimson. It is a slow, silent performance that has played out every evening for 2 millennia. The figures of the Dioscuri continue their watch, their features softened by the wind and the sand, becoming more like ghosts with every passing century. We are left to wonder about the hands that carved them, the calloused fingers that smoothed the stone and the eyes that looked up at this finished masterpiece for the first time. They left no written records of why they built it or what ceremonies took place within its shadow. They simply left the work itself, a silent witness to a civilization that understood the power of permanence in an ever-shifting world. The treasury is a reminder that even in the harshest environments, the human impulse toward beauty is irrepressible. It stands as a gateway, not just to the city of Petra, but to a deeper understanding of how we face the infinite. The Nabataeans knew that their time on earth was fleeting, like a footprint in the sand, and so they anchored their identity in the mountains. They turned the very bones of the earth into a testament of their existence, ensuring that even if their names were forgotten, their presence would be felt by anyone who walked through the narrow shadows of the Sikh and stepped out into the light. As the wind whistles through the high crevices of the canyon, it carries the faint scent of juniper and the dust of ages. The treasury remains, its secrets locked behind its rose-colored columns, inviting us to contemplate the vast stretches of time that separate us from its creators. In the quiet of the desert evening, the line between the past and the present begins to blur, and the stone seems to pulse with the heartbeat of a people who refused to be swallowed by the wasteland. They carved their dreams into the rock, and in doing so, they achieved a kind of immortality that no amount of hidden gold could ever buy. The silence of the treasury is not an empty one. It is a silence filled with the echoes of 1,000 caravans, the prayers of forgotten priests, and the enduring strength of a city built on water and stone. Close your eyes and imagine the scent of wood smoke and sun-warmed resin, a fragrance that drifts through the narrow canyons long before the first camel appears on the horizon. This is not the smell of the desert itself, but the smell of the world arriving at Petra's doorstep. As the echoes of the treasury fade into the stillness of the stone, we must look beyond the facades to the invisible threads that tied this canyon to the furthest reaches of the known map. The Nabataeans did not merely survive in the wilderness. They mastered the art of the intersection. To understand Petra is to understand the geography of desire. In the ancient world, luxury was not found in gold alone, but in the aromatic smoke of the gods. Frankincense and myrrh, harvested from the scarred bark of trees in the distant southern highlands of what we now call Oman and Yemen, were more precious than any metal. These resins were the lifeblood of the spirit, burned on the altars of Rome, the temples of Egypt, and the hearths of Han Dynasty China. And every ounce of that sacred cargo had to pass through the hands of the Nabataeans. They were the gatekeepers of the Incense Road, a winding, perilous trail that stretched for thousands of miles across the shifting dunes of the Arabian Peninsula. As the years passed, the city became a central nervous system for global commerce, a place where the Incense Road met the western terminus of the Silk Road. It is a staggering thought to consider the sheer variety of life that once crowded these sandstone corridors. Imagine a merchant who has travelled for 3 months from the edges of the Indus Valley, his pack animals laden with pepper, ginger, and turmeric. He arrives at the gates of Petra, weary and covered in the dust of a dozen kingdoms, only to find himself standing next to a Greek wine trader or a Roman official draped in purple-dyed wool from the Phoenician coast. The marketplace was a kaleidoscope of human experience, a cosmopolitan hub where languages blurred into a singular hum of negotiation. Here, the air was thick with the scent of exotic spices, cinnamon from the distant islands of the east, cloves that had crossed the Indian Ocean in fragile wooden dhows, and the sharp, earthy tang of cumin. There were piles of translucent silk, so light they seemed to float on the desert breeze, and heavy crates of bitumen from the Dead Sea used by the Egyptians for the sacred rites of mummification. The Nabataeans watched it all with a quiet, calculated grace, collecting their tolls and offering protection, transforming the raw volatility of the desert into a structured, profitable peace. We often think of ancient civilizations as isolated pockets of culture, separated by vast, impassable distances, but Petra proves the opposite. It was a place of radical connectivity. In the shadow of the great rocks, a nomad from the deep desert might share a meal with a scholar from Alexandria, discussing the movement of the stars or the price of grain in the markets of Gaza. This exchange of ideas was perhaps more valuable than the goods themselves. The Nabataeans were sponges for culture. They looked at the world around them and took what they found beautiful or useful, blending Egyptian motifs with Corinthian columns and Persian decorative flourishes. But how did they maintain such a monopoly over these roots? The answer lies in their intimate knowledge of the void. To the Romans or the Greeks, the desert was a place of death, a blank space on the map where armies vanished and water was a myth. To the Nabataeans, however, the desert was a fortress with invisible doors. They knew the location of every hidden cistern and every subterranean spring, many of which were camouflaged so perfectly that a thirsty traveller could stand directly above a gallon of fresh water and never know it was there. By controlling the water, they controlled the movement of wealth. They could lead a caravan through a landscape that would kill any pursuer, ensuring that the precious resins and silks reached the Mediterranean ports without ever falling into the hands of bandits or rival empires. As you wander deeper into the city's heart, past the great temple and the sprawling colonnaded street, you can almost feel the vibration of that ancient industry. The stone under your feet has been smoothed by the passage of millions of hooves and sandals. It is a path worn down by the weight of ambition. The Nabataeans were not just traders. They were the first true masters of logistics on a global scale. They understood that power did not come from the sword alone, but from the ability to move things, to bridge the gap between the producer in the east and the consumer in the west. There is a certain mystery in the way they managed this vast wealth. Unlike the Romans, who left behind endless records of their taxes and triumphs, the Nabataeans remained relatively quiet about the specifics of their business. We find their presence in the pottery shards, exquisite, eggshell-thin ceramics painted with delicate leaf patterns that have been discovered as far away as the shores of the Mediterranean and the banks of the Euphrates. These shards are like breadcrumbs through time, marking the reach of a shadow empire that preferred the subtlety of trade to the loud proclamations of war. The marketplace of Petra was not just a place of coin and contract, it was a sensory sanctuary. After weeks of the harsh, unrelenting sun and the monotonous yellow of the dunes, the city offered a riot of colour. Imagine the vibrant reds and deep blues of dyed textiles hanging from the stalls, the glitter of gold jewellery hammered into the shapes of desert flowers, and the polished sheen of Chinese Celadon porcelain. It was a place where the world felt small, where the distant corners of the earth were brought together in a single, narrow canyon of rose-red stone. And yet, for all its noise and activity, there was an underlying order. The Nabataeans were a people of law and contract. They created a society where a woman could own property and lead a business, a rarity in the ancient world, and where the king was seen not as a distant god, but as a first among equals who had to answer to the people. This social stability was the foundation upon which their commerce was built. Trust was the currency that allowed a merchant in Petra to send a shipment of frankincense to a partner in Rome, knowing that the payment would return across the sea and the sand. As the sun moves across the sky, casting long, rhythmic shadows across the valley floor, one begins to realize that Petra was more than a city. It was an idea. It was the idea that even in the most inhospitable corners of the world, humanity can create a center of gravity that pulls the rest of civilization toward it. The Nabataeans took the silence of the desert and filled it with the music of 100 different tongues. They took the barren rock and made it bloom with the riches of the Orient. We are left to wonder about the stories told around the campfires in the caravanserais, the large inns where the traders rested their animals and shared news from the road. What did they speak of? Perhaps they spoke of the Great Wall being built in the east, or the political tremors in the Roman Senate. Perhaps they shared maps of the stars, or tales of mythical beasts that lived beyond the edges of the known world. In the quiet of the night, as the camels grunted and the desert wind whistled through the high crags, Petra was the world's great listening post, a place where every secret of the Silk Road eventually found its way into the stone. The wealth that flowed through these streets was staggering, yet it was a fragile thing, dependent on the whims of empires and the changing tastes of distant gods. For a few glorious centuries, however, Petra was the undisputed queen of the wilderness. It was a city that defied the odds, a testament to the fact that with enough ingenuity and a mastery of the earth's hidden resources, one can build a paradise in the heart of a wasteland. The stone remains, etched with the memory of that golden age, waiting for us to listen to the stories it still has to tell. The sound of leather sandals meeting paved stone echoes differently here, a sharp rhythmic tapping that replaces the muffled crunch of desert sand. As we move deeper into the heart of the valley, the winding organic paths of the Nabataean ancestors begin to straighten, yielding to the rigid, geometric discipline of the West. This is the Colonnaded Street, a grand artery that once pulsed with the lifeblood of a global crossroads. It is here that the influence of Rome becomes undeniable, a stylistic marriage between the wild red cliffs of the East and the marble-clad ambitions of the Mediterranean. The street stretches out before us, a long, elegant ribbon of limestone pavers that once groaned under the weight of camel trains and the ornate carriages of the elite. To walk this path is to walk through a dream of order imposed upon a landscape of chaos. The Nabataeans, ever the masters of adaptation, did not merely submit to Roman aesthetics. They absorbed them, weaving the classical language of columns and pediments into the very fabric of their sandstone kingdom. The columns rise on either side like the petrified trunks of an ancient forest, their Corinthian capitals carved with delicate acanthus leaves that seem to flutter in the dry breeze. In its prime, this street was a sensory kaleidoscope. The air would have been thick with the scent of frankincense and myrrh escaping from the open doorways of the shops that lined the way. One can almost hear the low hum of a dozen different languages, Greek, Latin, Aramaic, and the native Nabataean tongue, mingling in the heat of the afternoon. Merchants, from the distant edges of the Silk Road, would have haggled over the price of Chinese silk and Indian spices, their voices rising and falling in a timeless dance of commerce. The stratigraphy, the study of these layered remains over time, tells us that this street was more than just a thoroughfare. It was a stage for the performance of public life, a place where the wealth of the world was displayed for all to see. To our left, the sound of trickling water draws the mind toward a structure that must have seemed like a miracle to a weary traveller arriving from the parched wastes. This is the Nymphaeum, a public fountain dedicated to the water nymphs, where the precious liquid was not merely stored but celebrated. In a city where every drop was a victory over the environment, the Nymphaeum was a display of sheer, unadulterated power. Water was piped in from the hills through an intricate system of terracotta conduits, spilling into a large basin shaded by a massive wild pistachio tree that is said to have stood there for centuries. Imagine the coolness of the spray on a face weathered by the desert sun, the sight of clear, flowing water in a land of dust and bone. It was a statement of abundance, a way for the city's rulers to say that they had tamed the elements themselves. As we continue along the paved way, the horizon is dominated by the sheer scale of the great temple complex. It is a massive undertaking of stone and spirit, covering an area of over 7,000 square meters. For decades, archaeologists have sifted through the rubble, using radiocarbon dating on organic fragments found within the mortar to pin down the exact moments of its construction and expansion. They found that this was not a static monument, but a living entity that grew alongside the city's fortunes. The temple rises in a series of monumental terraces, linked by grand staircases that seem to lead directly into the shimmering blue of the sky. The walls were once coated in bright white and red stucco, polished until they gleamed like jewels against the ochre backdrop of the mountains. Inside, the discovery of a small semicircular theatre, an Odeon, suggests that this was not just a place of prayer, but a seat of governance, a place where the council of elders might have gathered to debate the future of their desert empire. The daily life of a citizen in this red city was a delicate balance of cosmopolitan luxury and the harsh realities of the wilderness. A merchant might spend his morning at the temple, offering a handful of grain to Dushara, the lord of the mountains, before retiring to the shade of the colonnade to discuss the arrival of a caravan from the south. The children would have played in the shadows of the massive columns, their laughter lost in the vastness of the canyon. There is a profound sense of permanence in these stones, yet we know from the archaeological record that this stability was an illusion. The city was a machine, finely tuned to capture every drop of rain and every coin of trade. But machines require constant maintenance. The citizens were not merely inhabitants. They were stewards of a precarious oasis. As evening begins to settle into the crevices of the rocks, the shadows of the columns lengthen, stretching across the street like the fingers of a sundial. The heat of the day radiates from the stones, a gentle warmth that lingers long after the sun has slipped behind the peaks. In these quiet moments, the gap between the present and the deep time of the Nabataeans seems to narrow. We are left to wonder about the individuals who walked this very path, the architects who calculated the slope of the gutters to prevent flooding, the stonemasons who spent years perfecting the curve of a single arch, and the mothers who carried their children past the Nymphaeum on their way home. Their stories are not written in books, but in the wear and tear of the limestone, in the grooves worn into the steps by thousands of passing feet. The great temple stands as a silent witness to the peak of this civilization, a time when the Nabataeans were the masters of their own destiny. But even as they built higher and grander, the world around them was changing. The Roman Empire, once a distant trading partner, was becoming a more permanent presence. The colonnaded street, with its rigid geometry and classical flourishes, was a harbinger of this new era. It was a beautiful, sophisticated blend of cultures, but it also signaled the beginning of the end for the city's fierce independence. The mystery lies in how long they knew the change was coming, and whether they saw these grand monuments as a beginning, or a final, defiant flourish of their unique identity. We linger for a moment longer in the shadow of the temple, listening to the silence that now fills the space where thousands once gathered. The wind whistles through the empty doorways of the shops, a lonely sound that emphasizes the absence of the people who once made this street the center of their world. The stones remain heavy with the weight of centuries, holding on to the secrets of a life that was as vibrant and fleeting as a desert flower. The city was a triumph of the human spirit, a place where the impossible was made manifest in rock and water. And as we move forward into the deepening twilight of the valley, the memory of the colonnaded street follows us, a reminder of the beauty that can be found when different worlds meet in the heart of the wilderness. To understand the Nabataeans, one must eventually stop looking at the horizon and begin to look upward, toward the jagged crests where the sandstone meets the infinite blue of the desert sky. There is a specific kind of silence that exists only at the highest altitudes of the Red City, a stillness that feels heavy with the residue of ancient breath and the scent of juniper smoke. While the valley floor was a place of commerce and bustling crowds, the mountain peaks were reserved for the divine, serving as a bridge between the dusty reality of the earth and the celestial movements of the stars. The path upward is a marvel of ancient engineering, a series of hundreds of shallow steps carved directly into the living rock, winding and turning with the natural contours of the mountain. As we ascend, the sounds of the valley begin to fade, replaced by the rhythmic whistling of the wind through narrow crevices. This is the way to the high place of sacrifice, known to the locals as Al-Madba. It is perhaps the most complete cultic site surviving from the ancient world, a plateau leveled by human hands with such precision that it seems almost unnatural against the rugged chaos of the surrounding peaks. Here, the Nabataeans did not merely build upon the mountain, they transformed the mountain itself into a massive, open-air cathedral. In the center of this flattened expanse sits a rectangular altar, standing proud against the elements. Beside it, a shallow basin is carved into the stone, designed to catch the liquids of ritual, perhaps water, perhaps wine, or perhaps the blood of a sacrificed animal. There is something deeply humbling about standing in a place where people once sought to communicate with the unseen forces of the universe. We look at the drainage channels, still clear after 2,000 years, and we wonder what prayers were whispered into the wind as the offerings flowed. The Nabataeans were a practical people, masters of the physical world, yet their spiritual lives were clearly governed by a profound sense of the sacredness of high places. They believed, as many ancient cultures did, that the closer one stood to the heavens, the more likely the gods were to listen. Standing guard over this sacred plateau are two massive obelisks towering nearly 20 feet tall. To the casual observer, they might look like pillars brought from elsewhere and erected on the summit, but a closer inspection reveals a staggering truth. These obelisks were not moved here. Instead, the entire surface of the mountain peak was chipped away, inch by painstaking inch, leaving only these two monoliths standing. They are part of the mountain's original bedrock, solitary remnants of a peak that was lowered by the sheer will of human labor. This is a feat of lithic subtraction, a process of removing what is not needed to reveal the sacred form within. It speaks to a concept of time that we struggle to grasp today, a patience that spans generations, where the act of carving was itself a form of devotion. These obelisks likely represented the two primary deities of the Nabataean pantheon, serving as beitils, or houses of God. In their early history, these people did not depict their gods in human form. Instead, they worshipped them as unhewn stones, blocks of granite or sandstone that captured the essence of the divine without the limitations of a face or a body. The most prominent of these was Dushara, the lord of the Shara mountains. He was a god of the earth and the sky, a protector of the kingdom who embodied the strength of the rock itself. Beside him often stood Al-Uzza, a goddess of power and protection, frequently associated with the morning and evening stars. As the centuries progressed and the Red City became a crossroads for the entire known world, the religious life of the Nabataeans began to shift through the process of syncretism. This is a term archaeologists use to describe the blending of different beliefs and symbols, a merging of cultural identities that happens when people live at the center of a trade network. As they encountered the Greeks and the Romans, the Nabataeans began to see reflections of their own gods in the foreign deities. Dushara began to take on the attributes of Zeus or Dionysus, the god of wine and vitality, while Al-Uzza became identified with Aphrodite or Isis. This blending did not signify a loss of identity, but rather a sophisticated expansion of it. They were a people who could look at a Greek statue and a desert stone and see the same divine spark in both. On the high place of sacrifice, this fusion is felt in the very air. The rituals performed here were likely a complex tapestry of ancient nomadic traditions and the high ceremonies of the Hellenistic world. We can imagine the smoke of frankincense and myrrh, the very treasures that made the city wealthy, rising from the altars, carrying the hopes of a kingdom toward the clouds. The orientation of these sites also suggests a deep understanding of archaeoastronomy, the study of how ancient people understood the movements of the celestial bodies. Many of the altars and niches are aligned with the positions of the sun during the solstices or the rising of specific constellations. To the Nabataeans, the sky was a map, a calendar, and a scripture all written in light. By carving their places of worship into the highest points of the city, they ensured that their sacred rituals were perfectly synchronized with the rhythm of the cosmos. They lived in harmony with the deep time of the stars, recognizing that their empire, however grand, was but a small part of a much larger, eternal story. As we linger on the summit, the shadows of the obelisks grow long, stretching across the leveled stone like the hands of a sundial. From this vantage point, the entire city is visible below, a sprawling labyrinth of rose-colored stone. But up here, the noise of the market and the clatter of hooves are entirely absent. There is only the wind and the feeling of being suspended between two worlds. The Nabataeans understood that to truly thrive in the desert, one needed more than just water and gold. One needed a connection to the infinite. They left no written scriptures, no books of hymns or recorded myths to explain the exact nature of their faith. We are left to interpret the silent testimony of the stone. We see the hollows where oil was poured, the niches where small stone idols once sat, and the grand staircases that seem to lead directly into the clouds. These are the footprints of a civilization that walked with its eyes turned upward, finding beauty in the austerity of the heights and meaning in the enduring strength of the mountain. The high place of sacrifice remains a testament to the fact that the Red City was never just a place of business. It was a sanctuary, a fortress, and a temple all at once. The people who built it knew that the desert is a place of extremes, where life is fragile and the environment is unforgiving. In response, they created a spiritual landscape that was as permanent as the earth itself. As the light begins to soften, turning the sandstone from a fiery orange to a deep, bruised purple, the mystery of their worship feels closer, almost within reach, yet still protected by the vast, unyielding silence of the peaks. A heavy, rhythmic sound echoes softly through the canyon. The rhythmic strike of iron against stone, a sound that would have defined this valley for centuries. It is the sound of a mountain being slowly hollowed out, not to house the living, but to shelter the memories of those who have passed into the unseen world. As we move deeper into the heart of the valley, we encounter the street of facades, a long and winding row of tombs that rise up from the valley floor like a silent audience, watching the path of the traveler with blind stone eyes. Here, the sheer scale of the labor involved becomes almost overwhelming. Hundreds of doorways are carved directly into the vertical cliffs, some stacked one above another, creating a vertical neighborhood for the ancestors. The variety of these structures tells a story of a culture that was constantly absorbing the ideas of the world around it. Some facades are simple and austere, little more than a rectangular opening topped by a stepped pattern that looks like a stairway to the sky. These are the early works, perhaps, or the resting places of those whose lives were defined by the humble realities of the desert. But then, as your eyes travel higher, you see the influence of the great sea and the empires of the West. You see classical columns with their swirling capitals, triangular pediments that look as though they were plucked from a temple in Athens, and intricate friezes that speak of wealth flowing in from the silk and incense roots. It is a strange and beautiful fusion, a place where the rigid geometry of the Mediterranean meets the fluid organic curves of the Arabian desert. Looking at these graves, one begins to understand the social hierarchy that governed this hidden city. Archaeology often relies on stratigraphy, the study of layers in the earth, to tell us when a building was made, but here the hierarchy is written on the face of the cliffs. The complexity of a tomb was a direct reflection of the status the individual held in life. The most elaborate structures, with their multi-storied facades and deep internal chambers, were reserved for the elite, the merchants who had mastered the flow of gold, and the kings who claimed a divine right to rule. These were not just graves, they were monuments to success, meant to ensure that the name of the deceased would never be erased by the shifting sands of time. The smaller, simpler holes in the rock belonged to the artisans, the soldiers, and the laborers who kept the city breathing. Even in death, the inhabitants of the Red City maintained their positions, standing in a permanent, petrified line that stretched toward the heavens. We must wonder what these people believed waited for them beyond the final breath. The desert has a way of making the afterlife feel very close, as if the veil between the physical and the spiritual is worn thin by the wind. To the builders of this city, the ancestors were not truly gone. They were merely relocated to the stone. They believed that by carving these monumental homes, they were providing a vessel for the spirit to inhabit, a place where the family could return to offer libations and share a meal in the presence of those who had gone before. The tombs often feature small niches for lamps and altars for offerings, suggesting that the city of the dead was in fact a very busy place. It was a site of pilgrimage and memory, where the living and the dead coexisted in a quiet, respectful harmony. As we walk past these towering monuments, the silence of the stone seems to vibrate with the weight of forgotten ages. How many thousands of individuals lie within these cliffs, their names lost to the erosion of 2,000 years? We can use radiocarbon dating, measuring the decay of carbon isotopes in organic remains, to tell us roughly when a body was laid to rest. But the science cannot tell us what they whispered in their final moments, or what dreams they had for the children they left behind. The Nabataeans, as we call them, left behind very few written records of their own, leaving us to piece together their philosophy from the shapes they left in the rock. Theirs was a belief system rooted in the permanence of the mountain, a conviction that while the flesh is temporary, the stone is eternal. The craftsmanship required to create these facades is staggering when you consider the tools of the time. There were no scaffolds tall enough to reach the highest points of the cliffs. Instead, the masons likely started at the top, carving a narrow ledge and working their way downward, using the rock they had not yet cut as their floor. It was a process of subtraction, a slow, methodical removal of the mountain to reveal the temple hiding inside. One wrong strike of the chisel could ruin months of work, yet the lines are straight, the angles are precise, and the symmetry is hauntingly perfect. This level of dedication suggests that for these people, the transition to the afterlife was the most important journey a human could take. It was a journey that required a gateway worthy of the soul's dignity. And so, the street of facades remains a testament to a civilization that refused to be forgotten. As the shadows grow longer, the carvings seem to shift and move, the figures of eagles and lions appearing to guard the entrances to the dark interiors. You can almost feel the presence of the thousands who once walked these paths, their footsteps muffled by the soft sand. They built their city in a place where no one thought life could flourish, and they built their tombs in a way that ensured they would outlast the very empires that sought to conquer them. The Red City is not just a collection of ruins, it is a library of stone, each tomb a page, each facade a chapter in a story that we are only just beginning to read. Meanwhile, the wind continues its slow work, polishing the edges of the columns and softening the features of the statues. It is a reminder that even the most permanent structures are subject to the laws of deep time. The Nabataeans understood this, perhaps better than we do today. They knew that they were part of a vast, unfolding cycle, a rhythm of rising and falling that governed the stars and the seasons alike. By placing their dead within the heart of the earth, they were returning them to the source, ensuring that they would remain a part of the landscape forever. As the twilight deepens, the mystery of the city of the dead feels less like a puzzle to be solved and more like a poem to be felt. A song of stone that resonates through the quiet canyons, speaking of a time when the world was wide and the desert was a place of infinite possibility. A single rhythmic scratching sound begins to echo against the canyon walls, the sound of leather sandals pressing against weathered sandstone, repeating hundreds upon hundreds of times. To truly understand the scale of what the Nabataeans achieved, one must leave the comfort of the valley floor and begin the ascent. This is not a journey for the hurried mind, but a slow, deliberate climb up a stairway carved directly into the spine of the mountain. 800 steps, some worn smooth by the passage of centuries, others sharp and jagged as if the mason's chisel only recently left the rock. As the path winds upward, the air grows thinner and cooler, carrying the scent of wild herbs and the ancient dust of the heights. Each step taken is a step away from the bustling markets and the royal tombs below, moving toward a plateau that feels as though it exists in a different layer of time altogether. The climb is grueling, a physical meditation that forces the traveler to focus on the immediate, the placement of a foot, the rhythm of the breath, the way the light shifts from gold to pale amber as the elevation increases. The mountain seems to fold in on itself, offering glimpses of hidden crevices and sheer drops that disappear into the blue haze of the canyons. And then, just as the legs begin to heavy and the spirit begins to wonder if the summit will ever appear, the path rounds a final sharp corner. The world suddenly opens up into a vast, sun-drenched plateau, and there, standing in solitary defiance of the elements, is the structure known as Deir, the monastery. It does not reveal itself gradually. It strikes the senses all at once. Even for those who have spent days wandering the Treasury and the great temple, the sheer magnitude of the monastery is disorienting. It is massive, standing nearly 50 meters wide and 45 meters tall, yet it possesses a quiet, understated power that its more famous counterpart, the Treasury, lacks. While the Treasury is ornate and delicate, dripping with Hellenistic flourishes, the monastery is characterized by a profound, almost modern simplicity. Its lines are clean, its columns are thick and sturdy, and its facade is stripped of excessive ornamentation, as if the builders realized that at this altitude, the stone itself was enough. We must pause to consider the logistics of such a feat. In the realm of archaeology, we often speak of the chaîne opératoire, the sequence of operations required to create an object or a structure. Here, that sequence defies easy explanation. To carve a building of this size into the side of a mountain, thousands of tons of sandstone had to be removed, But unlike a traditional building where materials are brought to a site, here the site was the material. The Nabataeans worked from the top down, removing the mountain piece by piece, layer by layer, until the facade emerged from the cliffside. There was no room for error. A single misplaced strike of the hammer, a single flaw in the stone, and the symmetry of the entire work would be ruined forever. As we stand before the great doorway, which is large enough to accommodate a house, the silence of the plateau becomes heavy. Despite its name, the monastery was likely not a residence for monks in its original Nabataean life. Evidence suggests it was a monumental cultic space, perhaps dedicated to the deified King Obodas I. The interior is a vast, hollowed-out cube of stone, cool and dark, with a recessed niche at the back that once held an image of the divine. There is a strange, resonant quality to the air inside, a stillness that seems to vibrate with the memory of ancient rituals. The Nabataeans were masters of using space to evoke awe, and here, at the edge of the world, they created a sanctuary that feels like a bridge between the terrestrial and the celestial. But the monastery is only half of the experience. To walk past the facade, toward the very edge of the plateau, is to encounter a view that puts the entire history of the region into perspective. The ground falls away into a dizzying abyss, revealing the panoramic expanse of the Wadi Araba. From this vantage point, the desert is not a flat wasteland, but a complex tapestry of jagged peaks, deep shadows, and shimmering salt flats that stretch toward the horizon. On a clear day, the mountains of the Sinai Peninsula appear as faint, blue ghosts in the distance, and the entire Rift Valley unfolds like a map of the ancient world. It is here, looking out over the void, that the true genius of the Red City becomes clear. The Nabataeans did not just build a city, they mastered a landscape that most would find uninhabitable. They understood the wind, the way the water flowed through the hidden veins of the rock, and the way the stars aligned over the high places. They were a people of the margins, thriving in the spaces between great empires, creating a sanctuary of stone that was both a fortress and a work of art. The monastery stands as a sentinel, watching over the trade routes that once brought the wealth of the East to the doorsteps of the West, a silent witness to the rise and fall of kings. As the wind whistles through the high crags, one cannot help but wonder how many other secrets remain buried in the sands below or hidden in the inaccessible reaches of the surrounding mountains. The Nabataeans left us their grandest monuments, but they kept their deepest mysteries for themselves. They were a civilization that understood the power of the hidden, the way a secret, once kept, becomes a legend. And so, the monastery remains, a massive golden monument to a people who saw the desert not as a barrier, but as a home, a place where the earth itself could be shaped into a prayer, and where the silence of the heights speaks louder than any word ever written in the ledgers of history. The scent of incense and the rhythmic clatter of camel trains did not vanish overnight, but rather they began to mingle with a new sound, the steady, heavy tread of iron-shod sandals and the rustle of heavy parchment scrolls bearing the seal of an emperor. In the year 106 of the Common Era, the political winds shifted across the high plateaus of Edom, not with the roar of a sandstorm or the clash of a bloody siege, but with the quiet, inevitable gravity of a changing tide. The Nabataean kingdom, which had flourished for centuries as a fiercely independent merchant empire, finally bowed to the reach of Rome. It was a transition of remarkable stillness, a peaceful annexation that saw the kingdom transformed into the Roman province of Arabia Petraea. There were no burning temples or shattered walls. Instead, the city simply took a long, deep breath and began to speak a different language. As the years passed, the Nabataean kings stepped aside, and the Roman governors arrived, bringing with them the sprawling, structured logic of the Mediterranean world. Yet Petra did not lose its soul to the empire. It adapted, folding the grand architectural ambitions of Rome into its own rose-red canyons. The inhabitants of the city, ever the masters of cultural alchemy, began to blend their desert traditions with the imperial aesthetic. This was a time of immense growth, an era where the city's footprint expanded to accommodate the tastes of a global superpower. The Romans recognized that they had inherited a jewel, a strategic nexus that controlled the flow of wealth from the east, and they sought to leave a mark that was as enduring as the stone itself. Perhaps the most striking symbol of this new era is the Great Theatre, a massive semicircle of tiered seating that seems to grow directly out of the mountain's flank. While many Roman theatres were built from the ground up using mortar and stone, the architects of Petra chose a path of much greater resistance. They carved the theatre into the solid rock, slicing through ancient Nabataean tombs as if the history of the dead had to make way for the entertainment of the living. To sit on these cooling stone benches today is to feel the weight of deep time, the way the shadows of the past are literally etched into the architecture. Thousands of spectators would gather here, their voices rising in a soft murmur that echoed against the canyon walls, watching performances that likely blended local desert myths with the sophisticated dramas of the Roman stage. It is a place where the acoustics are so perfect that a whisper from the stage can carry to the highest tier, a testament to an understanding of sound and space that predates the modern world by nearly 2 millennia. The city began to change its shape to reflect this new imperial governance. A grand colonnaded street was laid down, its marble paving stones reflecting the harsh midday sun, creating a formal spine for the city's commerce and civic life. Where once there were narrow, winding paths suited for the solitary traveller, there were now wide avenues designed for processions and the display of power. Fountains, known as nymphaea, were constructed to celebrate the abundance of water, a luxury that the Nabataeans had mastered long ago, but which the Romans displayed with a newfound theatricality. The sound of trickling water, brought from miles away through sophisticated terracotta pipes, became a constant backdrop to the heat of the afternoon. It was a statement of mastery over the elements, a way of telling the world that even here, in the heart of the parched wilderness, the empire could provide the comforts of a distant home. One might wonder how the people of the cliffs felt as they watched their secret city become a provincial capital. The evidence suggests a period of vibrant synthesis. The Nabataeans did not disappear. They became Roman citizens, their elite families likely serving in the new administration, their merchants still navigating the treacherous trade routes that linked the Mediterranean to the Silk Roads of the East. The city was no longer just a hidden sanctuary. It was a cosmopolitan hub where a traveller might hear Greek, Latin, and Aramaic spoken in the same marketplace. The stratigraphic layers of the city, the physical record of its occupation, show a seamless blending of styles. Pottery remains from this period show the delicate, eggshell-thin Nabataean ware existing alongside the red-slipped terra sigillata of the Roman world, two cultures sharing a table in the shade of the high rocks. As the 2nd century progressed, Petra reached a peak of architectural splendor. The Romans added monumental gates and grand public buildings, but they always had to contend with the unique geography of the place. They could not impose a perfect grid upon a city defined by winding wadis and sheer precipices. Instead, they were forced to compromise, to bend their rigid imperial standards to the will of the sandstone. This resulted in a city that felt both familiar and utterly alien to a visitor from Rome. It was a place where the order of the empire met the chaos of the desert, where the straight lines of a Corinthian column stood in stark contrast to the swirling organic patterns of the wind-eroded cliffs. The governance of the city became more formal, more bureaucratic, but the mysteries of the desert remained just out of reach of the Roman administrators. Beyond the colonnaded streets and the public baths, the high places of the Nabataeans were still used for ancient rituals. The gods of the desert, Dushara and Al-Uzza, were slowly equated with the gods of the Roman pantheon, Zeus and Aphrodite, but the old names were still whispered in the quiet hours of the night. It was a time of double identities, a period where the city lived two lives, one as a loyal servant of the emperor and another as the eternal guardian of the sands. The transition to the province of Arabia Petra was not an end, but a transformation, a slow, deliberate evolution that ensured the city would remain relevant for centuries to come, even as the world beyond the canyons began to shift in ways no one could yet foresee. Imagine the sound of a heavy iron chisel meeting soft rose-colored sandstone, not to carve the face of a forgotten king, but to smooth away the sharp edges of a pagan god. By the 5th century, the air in the valley has grown cooler, thick with the scent of frankincense that now drifts toward a different heaven. The city does not fall into ruin. Instead, it undergoes a quiet, internal migration. The great temples, those towering monuments to Dushara and Al-Uzza, find themselves repurposed. The heavy curtains that once shielded the inner sanctums of the Nabataean gods are replaced by the vibrant tapestries of the Byzantine world. It is a time of architectural alchemy, where the bones of the old city are dressed in the robes of the new, and the echoes of ancient chants are slowly replaced by the rhythmic, steady drone of Christian liturgy. As the years pass, the grand urn tomb, that majestic facade carved high into the rock face, is consecrated as a cathedral. We can still see the inscriptions today, carved into the stone in the year 446, marking the moment the space was cleared of its ancestral spirits to make room for the saints. There is a strange, lingering peace in these spaces, a sense that the stone itself does not mind which name is whispered within its walls, so long as the prayers continue. The religious landscape of the 6th century is one of deep, shimmering complexity, a world where the old ways have not quite vanished, but have instead folded themselves into the shadows of the new basilicas. In this era, Petra is no longer the wild, independent capital of a desert kingdom, but a sophisticated Byzantine administrative centre. It is a place of bishops and scholars, of complex legal codes and meticulous record-keeping. And yet, for centuries, we believed this period was merely a long, slow decline, a fading twilight before the city finally succumbed to the desert sands. We thought the people had simply walked away, leaving behind nothing but empty shells and broken pottery. But the earth has a way of cradling the things we most need to remember, protecting them from the wind and the fire until the timing is right for their return. In the winter of 1993, during the excavation of a Byzantine church perched on a slope overlooking the Great Temple, archaeologists discovered a charred mass of carbonized material. At first glance, it looked like nothing more than the remains of a catastrophic fire, perhaps the result of an earthquake or a localized blaze that had brought the roof crashing down 1400 years ago. But as the researchers looked closer, they realized they were holding something miraculous. These were not mere ashes. They were scrolls. These are the Petra papyri, a collection of over 140 carbonized rolls of papyrus that provide an unprecedented window into the private lives of the city's inhabitants during the 6th century. Because they were carbonized, essentially turned into charcoal by the heat of the fire, the organic material was preserved in a state of suspended animation, shielded from the bacteria that would normally have caused them to rot away in the damp earth. They are fragile beyond measure, as delicate as the wings of a moth, requiring years of painstaking conservation to unroll and decipher. As the scholars began to read the Greek script hidden within the blackened layers, the silent era of Petra began to speak. These were not grand historical chronicles or religious texts, but something far more intimate and revealing. They are the legal archives of a single family, the family of a man named Theodoros. Through these documents, we see the meticulous details of dowries, the division of property, the disputes over water rights, and the complex web of marriages that held the social fabric together. We see a society that is deeply litigious, highly organized, and surprisingly prosperous, long after the history books suggested the city should have been a ghost town. The scrolls tell us of vineyards and orchards, of houses with multiple stories and private courtyards, and of a legal system that functioned with the precision of a clock. They reveal that even in the twilight of the Byzantine Empire, the people of Petra were still masters of their environment, managing the precious flow of water through the same channels their Nabataean ancestors had carved centuries before. There is a profound sense of continuity in these texts, a feeling that while the names of the emperors in Constantinople might change and the language of the liturgy might shift, the fundamental rhythm of life in the Red City remained tied to the land and the law. And so, we must ask ourselves how much more lies buried beneath the silt and the fallen stones. If a single room in a single church could hold the entire life story of one family, what other archives are waiting in the darkness? The Petra papyri remind us that our understanding of lost civilizations is often just a reflection of our own lack of evidence. We call an era dark simply because we cannot see into it, but for Theodoros and his neighbors, the 6th century was a time of bright sunlight, of bustling markets, and of the enduring hope that their children would inherit the same sturdy stone walls they had worked so hard to maintain. The transition of the city's religious identity was not a violent rupture, but a slow weaving process. In the Blue Chapel, named for its stunning pillars of Egyptian blue granite, we see the remnants of a world that valued beauty and symmetry above all else. The mosaic floors, depicting exotic animals and personifications of the seasons, suggest a culture that was still deeply connected to the natural world, even as it looked toward a singular, transcendent God. These mosaics are like frozen dreams, captured in thousands of tiny colored stones, a testament to the skill of craftsmen who saw no conflict between their ancient heritage and their new faith. Meanwhile, the changing religious landscape meant that the very geography of the city was being reimagined. The high places, where the Nabataeans had once sacrificed to the sun, became sites of Christian pilgrimage. The monastery, or Deir, one of Petra's most iconic and remote monuments, likely served as a place of secluded worship, its massive doorway a threshold between the world of men and the vast, silent reaches of the divine. You can almost feel the weight of the centuries as you stand in the shadow of its facade, imagining the monks who once climbed the 800 stone steps to reach this high plateau, leaving the noise of the trade routes far below. The Byzantine era represents a final, glorious flourishing of the city's ancient soul before the tides of history shifted once again. It was a time when the desert was still a highway, when the city was still a beacon, and when the written word was cherished enough to be saved, even by the very fire that sought to consume it. As we look upon the blackened fragments of the papyri, we are reminded that history is not a series of clean breaks, but a long, continuous thread, a thread that winds through the canyons, through the temples, and into the quiet, candlelit spaces of the churches, binding the past to a future that was yet to be written in the sand. The mystery of Petra is not just in how it was built, but in how it endured, how it adapted to every new wave of thought and every new empire that claimed its allegiance. It remained a sanctuary, a place where the harshness of the desert was met with the elegance of human ingenuity. But as the 6th century drew to a close, the world beyond the sandstone walls was growing colder and more uncertain. The great trade routes were shifting, the climate was beginning to change, and the long golden afternoon of the Byzantine world was starting to fade into a long, quiet evening. The scrolls of Theodoros would be the last great testament of this era, a final whisper from a city that was about to slip into the long sleep of the Middle Ages, waiting for a time when its stories would finally be told once more. Beneath the floorboards of a villa, a single ceramic lamp flickers, its flame dancing against walls that have stood for centuries, unaware that the very foundation of the earth is preparing to shudder. It is the year 363, in the heat of a July afternoon, when the long-standing contract between the city and the stone is violently renegotiated. The earth does not merely tremble, it heaves, a deep and guttural groan rising from the tectonic plates far below the red sandstone cliffs. In an instant, the sophisticated engineering that had sustained life in this arid basin for nearly a millennium is thrown into disarray. The great colonnaded street, once a marvel of symmetry and civic pride, buckles as the massive drums of the columns topple like felled trees, their weight shattering the paving stones beneath. The theatre, carved with such precision into the mountainside, feels the mountain itself attempt to shrug off its architectural adornments. Archaeologists, through the careful study of stratigraphy, that is, the reading of history through the layers of soil and debris stacked like pages in a book, have found the tragic signature of this moment. They see it in the way the walls fell, all leaning in a single panicked direction, and in the skeletons of those who were trapped beneath the falling masonry, their final moments frozen in the sediment of the 4th century. This earthquake was not merely a natural disaster, it was a fundamental shift in the city's destiny. The intricate network of ceramic pipes and hidden cisterns, the lifeblood that allowed thousands to thrive where only hundreds should survive, was severed. Fissures opened in the linings of the great water reservoirs, and the gravity-fed systems that had defied the desert's thirst for so long began to leak their precious contents into the uncaring sand. As the years passed following the great tremor, the city attempted to breathe again. But the rhythm was different. The repairs were hasty, often utilizing the rubble of grander buildings to patch up the walls of humbler dwellings. There is a profound sadness in the way a civilization begins to cannibalize its own golden age, using a beautifully carved frieze as a simple doorstep or a decorative capital as a base for a cooking fire. The trade routes, already weakened by the shifting political winds of the Roman and Byzantine empires, found the damaged city a less reliable harbour. The merchants, those nomadic conduits of wealth who once brought the scents of frankincense and the shimmer of silk through the sick, began to look elsewhere. They sought paths that did not require navigating a broken city struggling to mend its broken wells. Then came the slow, creeping death of the water systems through silting. Without the constant, disciplined maintenance of the Nabataean engineers, the flash floods that occasionally roared through the canyons began to bring with them a heavy burden of fine desert dust and gravel. In the past, the dams and settling tanks would have caught this debris, allowing the clear water to flow onward. But now, the tanks filled with mud. The narrow channels, once polished and smooth, became choked with grit. The water that did reach the city was no longer the cool, abundant flow of a mountain spring, but a meagre, muddy trickle. To lose one's water in the desert is to lose the right to remain, and slowly, the permanent population began to thin. The grand villas were partitioned into smaller units, then eventually abandoned to the owls and the lizards, their painted ceilings peeling away in the dry air. One can imagine the final families packing their few remaining belongings onto the backs of sturdy camels. They would have looked back at the towering facades of the tombs, those eternal faces of the rock that had watched over their ancestors, and realized that the city was becoming a ghost of itself. There was no single day of exodus, no dramatic final battle that cleared the streets. Instead, it was a quiet, century-long exhale. The sounds of the marketplace, the haggling in a dozen languages, the clatter of hooves, the singing of stonecutters, faded into a profound silence, punctuated only by the whistling wind. By the time the 7th century arrived, the city had transitioned from a bustling metropolis to a waypoint, a place where nomadic tribes might seek shelter in the caves, but where no one truly lived anymore. The desert is patient, and it began the long process of reclaiming what had been borrowed. Sand drifted into the doorways, burying the intricate mosaics beneath a protective shroud of beige and gold. The scrub brush took root in the cracks of the forum, its roots slowly prying apart the stones that humans had joined with such care. The Red City did not disappear. It simply withdrew from the memory of the wider world. It became a rumor, a legend told by the Bedouin around their fires, a story of a city of stone hidden deep within the mountains, guarded by spirits and the harshness of the terrain. The maps of the West grew blank in this region, the names of its streets forgotten, the purpose of its temples debated only by the stars that shone down on the empty plazas. This period of abandonment is a reminder of the fragility of even the most robust civilizations. We often think of stone as permanent, but without the human will to maintain the channels and clear the paths, even a city carved from the mountain itself can be swallowed by the landscape. The earthquake of 363 was the catalyst, but the true end came from the gradual loss of connection to the trade routes, to the water, and finally to the collective memory of the people who once called it home. The city entered a state of suspended animation, a deep and dreamless sleep that would last for over 1,000 years, as the sands rose higher and the silence grew deeper, preserving the secrets of the Nabataeans until the world was ready to look for them once more. The desert has a way of holding its breath, keeping its secrets behind a veil of heat and shifting dunes, waiting for a specific kind of curiosity to pierce the silence. For centuries, the city of stone existed only as a whisper among the Bedouin tribes, a ghost story told in the flickering light of campfires, a place that was known to be there but remained invisible to the eyes of the outside world. It was a phantom on the maps of the Enlightenment, a blank space where once a kingdom thrived. In the late summer of 1812, a man named Johann Ludwig Burckhardt moved through the jagged terrain of the Wadi Musa, his presence as quiet and unassuming as the dust beneath his feet. He did not travel as a scholar from Switzerland, nor as a representative of the Royal Geographical Society. To the world around him, he was Sheikh Ibrahim ibn Abdallah, a humble traveller from India, draped in the traditional robes of a pilgrim, his face weathered by the sun and his speech fluent in the nuances of Arabic. He had spent years preparing for this moment, immersing himself in the study of theology and language, transforming his very identity so that he might walk unnoticed through lands that were then strictly closed to Europeans. Burckhardt was a man possessed by a quiet, steady fire, a desire to find the source of the legends that spoke of a magnificent city carved into the very bones of the earth. He had heard the rumors of a place called Petra, the ancient capital of the Nabataeans, but to seek it openly was to invite suspicion, or perhaps even death. And so he crafted a story. He told his local guides that he had made a vow to sacrifice a goat at the tomb of Aaron, the brother of Moses, which sat atop a high mountain in the distance. It was a pious request, one that resonated with the local customs, and it granted him the passage he so desperately sought. As he followed his guide into the narrow, winding throat of the Sikh, the world began to change. The air grew cooler, the sunlight filtering down from a narrow ribbon of blue sky hundreds of feet above. The sandstone walls, striated with bands of deep ochre, violet and rose, seemed to press inward, creating a cathedral of natural stone that muffled the sounds of the outside world. Every footfall echoed softly against the canyon floor, a rhythmic ticking of time as he moved deeper into the heart of the mountain. He was walking through a geological miracle, a crack in the crust of the earth that felt less like a path and more like a portal into a forgotten epoch. And then the moment occurred, that singular, breathtaking instant that would change the course of history. As the narrow walls of the sick began to widen, a sliver of light caught a glimpse of something impossible. Through the darkness of the gorge, a monumental facade emerged, glowing with a soft, ethereal radiance in the morning sun. It was the Al-Khazneh, the Treasury, its columns and pediments carved with such precision and elegance that it seemed to have been conjured by magic rather than hewn by hand. Burckhardt, still maintaining his disguise, could only steal glances at the wonder before him. He could not stop to measure the stones or sketch the intricate carvings of the gods and goddesses. He had to keep moving, his heart racing beneath his robes, realizing that he was the first Westerner in over 600 years to lay eyes upon the lost heart of the Nabataean Empire. He wrote later in his journals that it was a work of art that surpassed anything he had seen in the ancient world, a testament to a civilization that had mastered the art of living in harmony with the harshness of the desert. But he also felt the weight of the silence. The city was empty, its grand theatres and vast tombs inhabited only by the wind and the occasional shepherd. The trade routes had long since shifted, the water systems had fallen into disrepair, and the memory of the kings who ruled from these cliffs had dissolved into the haze of deep time. When news of Burckhardt's discovery eventually reached Europe, it sparked a fever of fascination that would not break for a century. The Western world, gripped by the romanticism of the 19th century, became obsessed with the idea of the lost city. Poets like John William Bergen described it as a rose-red city, half as old as time, a phrase that captured the public imagination and transformed Petra from a geographical location into a symbol of mystery and vanished grandeur. It was as if a missing piece of the human story had suddenly been returned, a reminder that even the most powerful empires can be swallowed by the sand, leaving behind only the silent beauty of their architecture. As the decades passed, the initial wonder gave way to the more disciplined gaze of science. The late 19th and early 20th centuries saw the arrival of the first modern archaeological expeditions, men and women who came not just to look, but to understand. They began the painstaking process of clearing the debris of centuries, uncovering the layers of stratigraphy, the chronological layers of soil and stone that held the timeline of the city's life. They found the remains of sophisticated plumbing, the fragments of delicate pottery, and the inscriptions that began to give a voice back to the people who had lived there. These early excavators were faced with a puzzle of immense proportions. How had a nomadic people, who once lived in tents and followed the seasons, transformed themselves into master architects and hydraulic engineers? The more they dug, the more they realized that Petra was not just a city of tombs, but a living, breathing metropolis that had once supported tens of thousands of people in a landscape that should have been uninhabitable. They began to map the great temple, the Byzantine churches with their shimmering mosaics, and the humble dwellings of the common citizens, realizing that the city was far more vast than the initial glimpses through the sick had suggested. Yet for every question answered, a dozen more emerged from the dust. The archaeologists used every tool at their disposal, from the early techniques of careful brushing to the later developments of radiocarbon dating, a method of measuring the decay of carbon isotopes to determine the age of organic materials. They sought to pin down the exact moment of the city's rise and the precise reasons for its fall. They looked for evidence of the great earthquake of 363 and the slower, more insidious decline brought about by the changing tides of global commerce. But the desert is a patient guardian. Even now, with all our modern technology and our satellite imagery, it is estimated that only a small fraction of Petra has been fully excavated. The vast majority of the city remains buried beneath the sand, a subterranean world of temples, houses, and markets that have not seen the light of day for over a millennium. We are still, in many ways, like Burckhardt, standing at the entrance of the sick, catching only a glimpse of a much larger and more complex reality. The rediscovery of Petra was more than just a find for the history books. It was a confrontation with the limits of our own knowledge. It reminded us that the earth is a palimpsest, a parchment that has been written upon, erased and written upon again, and that beneath the surface of our current world lie the echoes of countless others. The excavations continue, one brushstroke at a time, slowly peeling back the layers of time, but the city remains shrouded in a certain degree of mystery, a place where the past is never truly gone, but merely sleeping, waiting for the next traveller to walk through the shadows of the stone. The scent of the air changes when the day begins to fold into itself, carrying the faint metallic tang of cooling iron and the dry ancient perfume of juniper wood smoke drifting from distant camps. It is a quiet transition, a softening of the edges where the sharp, jagged peaks of the Shara Mountains meet the darkening sky, and in this specific moment, the stone seems to breathe. The sandstone of Petra is not merely a static material, it is a living record of mineral deposits, a canvas of iron oxide and manganese that reacts to the shifting light as if it possessed its own internal fire. As the brilliance of the afternoon fades, the harsh yellows and dusty tans of the midday sun are replaced by a palette of deep violet, bruised plum, and a red so intense it feels as though the rock is glowing from within. This is the hour when the city truly earns its name as the rose-red city, though the colours are far more complex than a single flower could ever suggest. There are veins of white that look like frozen silk, swirls of ochre that mimic the movement of the sea, and bands of charcoal that remind us of the volcanic forces that shaped this land millions of years before a human hand ever held a chisel. To stand in the center of the valley now is to witness a slow-motion transformation, a visual symphony, where the architecture of man and the architecture of nature become indistinguishable from one another. The shadows grow long, stretching out from the deep recesses of the tombs, reaching across the colonnaded street like the fingers of a giant. These shadows have a weight to them, a density that seems to hold the echoes of the thousands who once moved through these spaces. The merchants haggling over the price of frankincense, the priests ascending the high places to offer prayers to Dushara, and the engineers who watched these very same sunsets 2,000 years ago, perhaps feeling the same sense of quiet satisfaction at the endurance of their work. They were a people who understood the permanence of stone, who realized that to carve into the mountain was to write a story that the wind and the sand could never fully erase. In our modern era, we have recognized this endurance by naming Petra a UNESCO World Heritage Site and one of the new wonders of the world. But these titles feel almost light and fleeting when compared to the sheer gravity of the place itself. We categorize it, we map it with lasers, and we protect it with laws, yet the city remains indifferent to our stewardship. It has survived the collapse of empires, the shifting of trade routes, and the violent tremors of the earth that brought down its great temple and shattered its arches. It exists in a state of suspended animation, a bridge between the deep time of geology and the flickering candle flame of human history. The ingenuity of the Nabataeans remains the most haunting element of this landscape. We often think of progress as a linear climb, a steady march toward greater complexity, but when we look at the hydraulic systems of the Rose City, the terracotta pipes that moved water with such precision that they accounted for the exact degree of gravity-fed pressure, we are forced to confront the possibility that we are not the first to master our environment. These desert builders did not fight the wilderness. They listened to it. They understood the secret language of the flash flood and the hidden potential of the dry wadi. They built a paradise in a place where life should have been impossible, and they did so with a grace that modern engineering rarely achieves. As the stars begin to prick through the velvet canopy of the Jordanian sky, the great Treasury, or Al-Khazneh, stands as a pale sentinel at the end of the Sikh. In the moonlight, the red rock turns to silver and ash, and the Corinthian columns seem to stretch upward into the infinite. We are left to wonder how much more lies beneath our feet, hidden under the centuries of accumulated silt and sand. Archaeologists estimate that only 15% of the city has been uncovered, meaning that the vast majority of Petra's secrets are still cradled in the dark, cool earth, protected from the sun and the prying eyes of the present. There are libraries yet to be found, domestic quarters that still hold the pottery of a forgotten meal, and perhaps the tombs of kings whose names have been lost to the wind. There is a profound peace in this realization, the knowledge that the world still holds mysteries that have not been catalogued or digitized. It allows the imagination to wander through the unexcavated hills, to see the city not as a ruin, but as a vibrant, pulsing hub of human ambition. The Nabataeans may have vanished as a distinct political power, their language fading into the roots of Arabic and their gods merging with those of the Romans and the Byzantines, but their spirit is etched into every curve of the rock. They taught us that even in the harshest of environments, beauty is a necessity, and that a civilization is defined not by what it consumes, but by what it leaves behind. The wind picks up slightly, whistling through the narrow crevices of the Sikh, a sound that has been described by travellers for centuries as a low, mournful flute. It is the sound of the desert breathing, a reminder that we are merely guests in this landscape of stone. The fires in the Bedouin camps on the surrounding plateaus flicker like fallen stars, connecting the present moment to the ancient past in a single, unbroken line of human presence. Here, time does not move in a straight path. It circles back on itself, swirling like the patterns in the sandstone walls. As the cold of the desert night settles into the valley, the Red City begins its long sleep once more. The carvings of eagles and lions watch over the empty theatres and the silent markets, waiting for a dawn that has arrived 10,000 times before and will arrive 10,000 times again. We leave the city to the ghosts and the starlight, carrying with us a piece of its silence, a sense of the immense scale of history, and the humbling knowledge that even the greatest of our works are but whispers in the ear of eternity. The mountain holds its breath, the sand settles into the cracks of the pavement, and the rose city remains, secret, sacred, and still.